Welcome again to American Zarathustra. I'm extremely pleased to have Tyler Hamilton from Radix EBL. Say hello, Tyler. How are you doing today?
Hello, not bad. How are you, Donald?
Very good. And my dear friend Nullus from the White Art Collective and Abnormocracy.com, the great poet Nullus. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much.
Very good. So this past week has been a very exciting and interesting week in Imperium Art and the discussion of Imperium Art. It's out there and it's growing legs on its own. It's off and running. Although we're still working on our projects and our thoughts, our essays, a lot of offline conversations discussing the development of this, and a book that Nullus and I will be doing with art and poetry, along with Tyler's essay and other people's essays. So we thought, we really need to chat a little bit more about these topics and respond to what other people are talking about online about Imperium art. So one of the topics that came up today, somebody who reached out to me, she was asking from the Imperium art point of view, where is Imperium art on the scale of art versus propaganda? So I don't know, maybe Tyler, would you like to approach that one?
Sorry, there was a lag when I went to unmute it for some reason. Um, yeah, I'll take a stab at that. I mean, the first thing I should say, though, is propaganda is not always a negative thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's often taken to be that way, but propaganda is just basically mean a message that's put out there that's meant to form a community and inform its self-understanding. Sometimes propaganda is a negative thing because it's for a system we don't like, but often propaganda could be the right thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't immediately think about propaganda in a negative sense, but I think the difference with Imperium art is what we're aiming to do is it's informing a self-understanding, but unlike propaganda, it's not on the level of direct political messaging in the sense that we're listing all the names of present trends or global financiers or opposing geopolitical empires that we find a problem and we're trying to unite an already given political community around a shared enemy, right? Which is
Mm-hmm.
largely the origin of a lot of community is ritual sacrifice and a shared view of the enemy, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I think with Imperium art, it's more about, as we were saying before, trying to answer the diaspora by giving something that unites all Europeans in their self-understanding while maintaining their ethnic differences that make all those individual cultures what they are. It's a way of communicating with each other, and in that sense, it's intersubjective, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what we're doing is forming a new self-understanding that is more a part of a generative horizon in the sense that we're generating a new horizon of meaning in which we could approach our own self-understanding and see ourselves in the world with meaning rather than the present state of atomization. So it's
Mm-hmm.
unlike propaganda in the sense that it's not relating to direct political concerns, but it's more about creating a new horizon within which you could form these new concerns and these new symbol languages and et cetera, et cetera.
That's beautifully said. Nellis, did you want to respond to that?
No, I mean, yes, I do, but not respond as much as just expand on it. So absolutely correct that propaganda is by definition not a negative or a positive. It just exists, and it's a question of how we contextualize propaganda, which can make it pejorative or positive. It's all relative. So I would say that in my essay, I've actually approached this or discussed this very briefly. And what I did was I expanded on T.S. Eliot's three categories of defining religious literature. And in this case, I included the concept of national identity into this theme. And what we're saying is first you have explicit works of Imperium art that blend literary qualities with a clear signal of a metaphysical or moral inspiration as it relates to European culture and biological identity. And second is more of an implicit work of Imperium Art that articulates the devotional work of art as expressed through treating themes of Western culture and the metaphysical experience as part of the subject. And thirdly, you'll have these clear expressions of Western culture and the metaphysical experience as a form of outright propaganda. So it's the third category is something where you're directly promoting something very specific. In the second, let me go back to the first. So in the first, it's more of a, it's a devotional. It's kind of like it's like the word is the first one. The second one is more of a devotional kind of approach where you're blending in elements of these into your work, and the third is a very direct expression of a particular action or a theme.
Profound. This is something that we're going to get into more and more in the coming weeks as we discuss this and open this up more to the public and other intellectuals that are interested in engaging that. Sometimes, though, the topics can be so enormous that I always sort of try to pull it down a little bit and get it a bit grounded, try to single out specific topics and then move forward. So one thing I wanted to, I was inspired by Tyler and what he was saying, this kind of, being on the horizon between the past and the future, but recognizing the totality of ourselves as a white imperium globally, sort of moving forward towards our self-determination, towards freedom from parasitism, And I'd say that Imperium Art is an art historical approach to all this. It's a way of saying, what's happening in the arts, in the dissident right, in white identity politics, and where is it going? So that I think is a pretty clear definition right there. The propaganda thing is an interesting thing because off the top of your head, you immediately think of like World War II propaganda, where the sort of cartoonized Japanese with big buck teeth and, slanty eyes, or the, communist propaganda about the proletariat and heroism and all that. So, but of course, today, I think probably propaganda is far more subtle and insidious because we're in this media culture that surrounds us at all times. And it's almost like a kind of, I don't know, sort of like mind control device that we're involved in with all this different type of propaganda. So I from my answer, I think is perhaps, yes, there is a level of propaganda to what we do, but not necessarily intentionally. That being that, John Doe in some art organization is making white positive art, conscious of the fact that white genocide is happening, white replacement is happening, all the machinations of socio-political events going on in our time, and he or she, in this case, makes a song or a poem or a painting, etc., that cries out from that awareness. So that person is making some form of what I would call Imperium Art, whether they mean to or not, and also that it exists as propaganda in some sense, that it's influencing other whites to kind of, it's creating a cognitive dissonance in them against the propaganda that they're already brainwashed with. So it's really an ongoing discussion, I suppose, and we're kind of following along, running alongside the arts, and kind of watching what happens as we go. So I suppose that's, we kind of leave that question as an open-ended one. What are your thoughts?
I just wanted to add that maybe the way I should explain what I just said earlier was, think about the first category of an explicit work of Imperium Art that is basically your foundational work, your mythology, so to speak. So you could talk about folk tales, you could talk about mythological epics, you could talk about historic epics that were written in the past. The Iliad could be a good example of this. So you'll have these foundational works in the history of the European experience, that can provide this first category as a foundational work of European that expresses that European sense of identity through this metaphysical experience. The second one, the second category would be something of the nature of what we're doing in the White Art Collective, for example, where we blend in elements of the love of home or the searching for a home that Hyrith does excellently in many of her songs.
Beautiful.
So those are expressions in the second category that blend in these elements and use these foundational elements as a source to express more of an implicit feeling and an emotion that harkens on to this same theme. And the third expression is more a very overt declaration of sorts. So that could be expressed, for example, in a poem that is a call to action for something very specific. But usually, as Tyler accurately put it, there has to be a very specific theme to it. It has to be very directed. So I don't think that we see much of propaganda in Imperium Art yet. That doesn't mean that it couldn't happen and it won't happen. I think that for the moment we have that first category through our history. We have that second category through the experience that or the evolution of our experiences as we're seeing it now. And the third one will probably evolve. And I'm not saying there isn't propaganda in art right now on our side. I'm just saying that it's not as prevalent as the second category.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Tyler, anything else on that topic?
Sorry, it keeps doing this delay thing. No, I think we've hit on that note pretty well.
Much covered that. Yeah, sounds good. So this past week, I completed my first exemplar of what I think of as Imperium Art. So I created a painting. It's about 2 foot by 2.5 feet. It's multi-medium on paper, watercolor, ink, color pencil. And I think the piece, I mean, this is something that it's the first time I've done something intentionally with Imperium Art in mind. I certainly have done other works of art that are approaching, this thought and, are expressing levels of, white identity politics and that kind of awareness, more so in my music, to be honest. But yeah, so here you guys I sent you a copy, so we're looking at it, and I people can certainly find it on my Twitter, Facebook. I'll make it available. So the piece here is, let me first talk a little bit about art critique. And then even before that, I have to say that not all of us can be artists. Not all of us can be philosophers, but we're all part of the spirit and the movement and the community of this. Art, really, what would art be without a community? That it's for and from, you see. So it's a kind of a symbiotic relationship between the sort of the, I guess, consumers of art or the viewers of art and the creators, and of course the art historians, the philosophers. We're all kind of playing different instruments in one band, if you will. So this idea, the work. For starters, there's line, color, shape, form, light, texture, balance, movement, pattern. These are the terms that you want to use as your approach to looking at a visual work of art and critiquing it. So it's something that I'm going to go into a bit more in future videos. So I think, in time, people can look back at this video and be a little more informed on that. So here with this piece, I'll talk a little bit about the structure of it. And then maybe we can break down the relationship of the meanings of the different parts, because my approach to this is I don't know how to put it. I don't want to say modern, because I almost feel like that's a dirty word now in our sphere, but I'm breaking down different parts of the image, where I have parts that are colored, parts that are black and white. You have parts that are framed, and then there's sort of an open area. You have a difference in scale. So, for example, the main character, this mythological, almost godlike character, representing, say, the Western biospirit, is he's in scale to everything else. He's giant. So the scale obviously represents an area of focus or importance in a work of art. And then there's, this hackneyed term, the juxtaposition of things. You only say that when you're trying to be pretentious at art openings. So the juxtaposition of, the burning church in the background to the scene of the crucifixion on, in the sort of the bottom left, the characters in the crowd, the flow of the blood past the sword. I'm going to say blood and soil. This is a term that has some meaning in our movement for blood and soil. The position of the sword within that, the symbols on the sword. What do those symbols mean, and how does that relate? Why is the sword made of gold? For example, the helmet having it's sort of a lion helmet. What's the symbolism of the lion? The blood flows down to a scene of child sacrifice to Moloch. If you just Google Moloch, this picture will show up, over and over. It seems to be there's not a lot of artwork on this topic. If there is, they're copies of other artworks of the same image. And then I'm using the smoke from Moloch, that statue, to lead the eye upwards towards this eagle holding a double-headed snake. That is the heads of the snake are upside down. And then, of course, one of the dominant aspects of this image is this kind of tree with its vines grown all around this giant character, this sort of warrior king character. And then within the vines, if you look closely, you will notice something, which I think it's not like a big secret. I think anyone with eyes can probably see the symbols that I have inside there. So the eagle, what does an eagle represent? The snake, what does that represent? What does the blood represent? So me asking these questions is pulling you towards the critical analysis of this piece. And then the question is, okay, there's an eagle in the picture. What's its relationship to this sort of warrior king? Is it protective? Is it offensive? Is it, what's the meaning of the use of the color green? How does that tie certain things together? So, and then the image of the burning church, for me personally, is one of the most profoundly disturbing and enraging things that I can think of. It's there's a picture. It's one of those famous photos from when Notre Dame was burned down. This is just sort of a news, sort of a journalist in a crowd, and he turned around and took a snapshot of the people looking up at the burning Notre Dame Cathedral. And there's a white French woman looking up in incredible horror and sadness. And right next to her is a Muslim migrant with incredible glee and joy, and just he was so excited. And so that picture right there says it all. It says it all. And I feel like this image of the burning church is an icon that I think I would like to incorporate in more of my pieces. I might just use a lot of these symbols and kind of reuse them over and over in some way to create some kind of symbolic language that represents Imperium art, that speaks to our people. I suppose the propaganda word is coming up again in my mind. I don't know if you guys would consider this to have some level of propaganda to it, but I'd like to just get your impressions. Don't feel like there's a right and a wrong thing to say. It's more, what is it? How do you make sense of this based on the things that I've been talking about? So let's see, Nullus, would you like to give it a shot?
Yes, yes. Well, when I first saw this painting, the first thing that caught my eye was the burning church. It
Mm,
reminded me immediately of Notre Dame,
mm,
and sort of it almost felt like everything was flowing from that event. And
mm,
again, the way I felt was that this was flowing, counterclockwise.
mm-hmm,
And so for me, the burning church symbolized the blood of Christianity, the sacrifice of Christ as
mm,
it was flowing down. And what I found very interesting, and it was interesting because the first thing I'm not really familiar with the statue,
mm.
but I think I even messaged you this, and I said, isn't that the Moloch concept? And
Correct.
I just instinctively understood that that's what it meant,
Mm,
even though I never saw the image before.
mm,
So as I'm moving counterclockwise, I see sort of also a little bit of hope and a little bit of sadness at the same time, because that central figure is almost the hands of this
mm,
sort of clock, and the central figure is this sort of I guess the embodiment of Europa, the embodiment of us.
mm-hmm,
And so the way I'm understanding this through the symbolism is that although the first thing I thought that the tree was the tree of life,
mm,
and that it was helping him stay up, but then I took a closer look at the vines, and then I realized something was very interesting inside these vines, and that sort of made me think that this is pulling him down as opposed
mm-hmm,
to propping him up.
mm,
So all of these images definitely tells me a clear story here. Um, Now, if you brought up the question of propaganda, I would say that this work is actually a propagandist
mm-hmm,
piece,
mm-hmm,
because it shows a very clear, very specific message, and it shows a very clear adversarial positioning,
mm,
and it shows exactly what's going on and what the cause and effects are, essentially. So
mm.
it's a very explicit expression of that. Once you start looking into the symbolism, once you start seeing the flow, at least from my point of view. So that's what my general impressions are.
That's deeply gratifying to hear, actually. There's a level an artist cannot tell people. It's foolish to say this means this, or just today on Twitter, somebody tried to tell me what I meant by making this painting, which was a bit absurd. But there's a level of cognitive dissonance or a level of interpretive space where people bring their own understandings, their own background, their own values, their own impressions to it, and to break it down and interpret it. And in so doing, they own it. They become part of the painting. It becomes part of them, and that's part of the transformative experience of art. So I think that the exciting thing about your analysis is how you brought the element of time into this, the sequence of
Mhm.
events, that this is like a counterclockwise motion. There's a cause and effect between these four corners, and that they kind of revolve around the white imperium or the European biospirit.
Mhm.
I'm really delighted with your thoughts on that. That's
Oh, and just a disclaimer, I am a horrific art critic, so just want to make sure that it's out there.
all right. Then put that down in the books. Okay.
Yeah.
Tyler, could you join us? Could you share some thoughts on this? What was your first impression?
Yeah, I tend to agree with Nullus. It's more of a propaganda piece. What immediately struck me, of course, is also what Nullus was saying with the vines pulling down the Western figure, the Western archetype, and the shared color of green among the vines, the snake,
Mm,
and the rabbis that are handing babies over to
mm,
the demonic looking entity there.
mhm,
And what that immediately struck with me, of course, in relation to the burning church and then the blood down from the crucifixion and tied in with the green, is when you look at the snake, which I think Brahman would call Caducean, if I believe that's the correct word. But what came to mind for me was the Ouroboros, which is a snake that eats its own tail, which means basically life feeding on life. So what you have happening is life feeding on life, which is effectively the rabbis are, and at the bottom the Muslims are feeding on the Western spirit, essentially.
Precisely. Yeah.
And what the eagle is the eagle is that return on top of it as a guardian. It's an awakened spirit that's trying to break the cycle of life feeding on life so the European spirit can live again. So that's my immediate takeaway from it. Especially when you also have the sword, which is tied down to the blood and it's stuck essentially in the ground. And on that sword, you have the British Union, a fascist symbol, for example. You have a sense of historicity in past struggles of this very same fight, and it's being pulled down, and what the spirit is trying to do is to break that cycle and let that figure stand once again.
Beautiful, beautiful. The vines, in a sense, do they not also live off of or suck off of the main character that they're growing around? You know, there's this is an idea, you know, of parasitism that I mentioned earlier, that, you know, the white diaspora or the white imperium, the difference between imperium and diaspora is that we would be breaking these vines. You know, we would be kind of pulling off the parasites from us. And I'm really, really glad that you noticed those other symbols in there. I'm going to be reading more about the Caducean and contemplating that more as I go forward in the development of my art. I am kind of curious of what you guys thought of the use of the flow of blood in this piece, if that specifically. See, you have to look at it like this is in a sense like a play. It's like a one-act play on a stage, and all the dialogue and all the action are happening simultaneously. So there's things that are happening that lead to the next thing, just like any kind of a play, TV show, movie. You know, you have your inciting incident, and then the plot thickens, and then would lead to the climax. The return to the status quo, whatever those elements might be. But that specific thing, I don't know. I was curious what your impression was of the use of blood. Nullus?
There was an interesting thing that just popped to caught my attention, just as you're mentioning it. In a sense, it almost feels like the sword is acting as a dam, holding back the blood from going forward toward the sacrifice. And
yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I don't want to cut you off. You're right in the middle of a flow.
Yeah, so it sort of has a double meaning, right? So actually triple meaning in the sense that you have the blood and soil concept, how, you know, the crucifixion, the blood of Christ flows into the blood of the European nation, or the Europeans, the nations of Europe, how it ties together, how the sword is also there to protect it.
I think I want to jump in real fast.
Yeah.
The way that I put the sword in front of that black and white scene of the crucifixion is I think protective. I think it does show a sort of like, you know, you shall not pass, if you will. It's a analogy, but I think you get my point.
Yeah, that's what I was. That's kind of what I felt, that sword is there to protect the blood from flowing further, because if it does flow, then it becomes a sacrificial victim to Moloch, essentially.
Thank you. Yeah, that's just because this is a problem that I have. I don't know how to phrase this. In the dissident right, we have this term pathological altruism. And it's this tendency of whites to want to help others so much that we end up making ourselves vulnerable to other racial and ethnic groups who then use that against us and harm us. And so, in a sense, like the stop of that blood flow in some ways is like controlling the level of like how how much compassion we give to others. Are they vampires, or do they appreciate our sacrifices and the things that we give them from altruism? These are significant questions within white identity politics anyway.
I've been thinking about this topic of the pathological altruism, which I do believe exists to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
But what I really think that it is, I would rather call it pathological moralization.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And the reason is that it's signifying more of a signal to show their virtue, and it's signifying it in a very selfish manner, and this is exactly what, if we take the Christian approach to it, this is exactly one of the main things that Christ was warning us against. So it's a very interesting concept. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would add to that. I've always taken issue with the idea of pathological altruism.
Okay.
I think Nullus is more on the money with pathological moralization in the sense that it's related to virtue signaling. But the thing for me is it doesn't have that much to do with altruism. If you look at where these kinds of virtue and social signaling actually come from, it comes from the fact that when you take the state and you take big corporations, what they do is they try to form an ideological representation of the kind of incentives they're providing in order to, for example, bring in more mass immigration, right? Or to invade another country in order to maintain, say, the stability of the American petrodollar, right? And so what ends up happening is it takes a representation where they're representing their own actions to it, as in we're bringing democracy to the Middle East, right? Which is not, as it's often said, like a cynical ploy that's really hiding their interests, like they're wielding it, but rather it's a certain thing that they actually believe in. But what that's actually producing is the homogenizing effects of that system. And so it becomes an ideological representation that effectively plays into how the whole of society sees itself. So when you look at people who virtue signal a lot, like in academia or in the business world, when it comes to like diversity hiring and public relations and things like this, is the reason they signal is not because they're so altruistic and overflown with love for the other. It's because of the fact that you are effectively ostracized if you don't, right? And so what happens is the only way that you see yourself is along the lines of the power relations, and those power relations carry this ideological representation with them, and you're expected to conform to them. So what happens when people, quote unquote, take the red pill? They go through a period of turmoil where they're questioning whether or not their new beliefs are even moral to have. And so it's not so much an issue of altruism or something that's ingrained in us. It's a result of the very particular power relations that we live under. And so I've always disputed the idea of pathological altruism. But as for the blood and the sword, I think this could be taken a few ways, actually. You guys were talking about it like a dam, which is one way to take it. You could also take this as in a more Christian sense and talk about the way in which the blood is cleansing the sword, perhaps. And this is...
Oh, what a great turn around. That's well done.
Thank you. And then, so you could say that, and then, but you could also do the opposite of that. And you could, if you're one of those that are more critical of Christianity, you might say it's the blood in the sword that's keeping the sword put where it is, because Christianity is this, evil universalist project that led to Europe's downturn. Now, that's not something I actually agree with. I would take the Christian interpretation, but nonetheless, that is an interpretation that somebody could make. But just to add two more possible interpretations to the dam one you were saying, I would say you could talk about it as a cleansing of the sword, which, if you look at the colors of the eagle, are actually very similar to the colors on the sword. So that could be perhaps stronger of the two interpretations, but that's what I think about it anyways.
See, what's happening here is the power of art. It's the use of space and color and symbol and movement patterns, all of these things that come together, and the mind works for it. You have to work for it. You have to dig and excavate the meaning and put things together. The more you kind of torture the data, as it were, the more gold comes out of it. It's like a fountain. And the beauty of it is that when the work is done, it really is a child that's left the home. It's on its own. If it, like any human being, it has flaws and good things, and it has to stand on its own. No matter how much I talk about it, that's actually like an excuse. You don't want to talk about it. It's like trying to explain why a joke is funny. So I'm interested in listening to the way that you guys break this down. I love the fact that you both have so much knowledge and you're bringing your knowledge base into this. And so this is an example to our people and to artists in the dissident right about how to engage our audience and our people, and to kind of draw them in closer into these things so that people feel a sense of identity, connection. They can say, this is my art. This is the art of my people, my struggles, the things that matter to us. And there's enough kind of looseness around the edges where people can go and say, well, I think this means this and this means that, and draw their own conclusions. That's really key. So I'm going to kind of turn it around a little bit on a sort of a negative critique of myself and this, not myself, but my art in this case. And that is that if this is a kind of leaning more towards propaganda, does that make it low art? Is it, now it's the discussion of high art versus low art. Somebody that I spoke to today earlier really thinks of propaganda as low art, and I understood her position, the idea that there's less room for interpretation. It's almost more like graphic design, only it's selling a political idea, rather than a product, lipstick or Coca-Cola or what have you, So do you feel that it's being, that it's being too obvious kind of makes it lean more towards low art, or what are your thoughts on that? Nullus?
Not at all. I would say that if we were to take the T.S. Eliot interpretation of it that I was speaking about earlier, then propaganda is just another expression of art. And each one of these expressions, I would exclude the foundational expression, but the other two categories, they all have their versions of high art, middle art, and low art. I don't think that you could categorize propaganda as a form of low art per se. I think that would be disingenuous.
Okay.
That's the way I would say that.
Okay. And Tyler?
Yeah, I largely agree with Nullus, really. I mean,
well, that's not fun.
I know that's not very fun, but yeah, I mean, like, distinction with low art and high art, I largely think it goes back to the manner in which it's an expression of, in a sense, the work of the artist, in the sense of what's put into it, as compared to, say, mechanical reproduction. We talked about before, where it's like, Andy Warhol is just putting a bunch of pictures of tomato cans.
Yes, who I call the Antichrist of art. But.
Yeah, well, it serves a very strictly utilitarian purpose, right? In which case it's a consumer purpose.
Right.
But not all art, which even has propagandist purpose, is necessarily one in which to return to it is not going to be a convicting encounter, or a eye-opening encounter, or one that repeatedly draws you in, because even though it has a distinct purpose to it, it's still nonetheless an expression of where we are right now. And that is something which, even if you take the multitude of what we approached it as we ended up in a very in some interesting terms and questions that we had from looking at it over what exactly the nature of that struggle is. Well, something that's low art is not something that's going to make you think about that. It's going to make you think about something that's repetitive or easily shared and glanced at, right? Or something simply pleasing to the eye, or something that's in the background, like pop music.
Sort of decorative in some sense, or easily consumed and then thrown away. These are.
Just to quickly interrupt. I mean, if you look at ancient Spartan poetry, I mean, I was speaking of Tiratus in one of the Conversations with the Wind episodes. I mean, that's clear propaganda, yet it's still considered high art. So, I mean, if you believe that propaganda is not a part of high art, then you will have to say that the Spartan poet Tiratus is not a part of that tradition. So people have to make a decision.
So this is quite excellent. I appreciate our discussion on that. I'm going to move on to another topic. There was a gentleman who was so inspired by our last discussion, which is on my YouTube channel, that he went and wrote an article on his thoughts. A lot of times our people in the white identity politics, we create these cool names, but they're very hard to pronounce. So this gentleman goes by what looks like Treurerunen, Treurunen. And I'm going to add the link to his article underneath this video, so you guys can work on that. But his he was quite interested in our discussion on Imperium Art, and he links to the video that I'm referring to on my channel. So the title of his article is called White Imperium versus Diaspora. And it's not so much a discussion on art, or specifically our rendition of Imperium Art, but literally the difference between the concept of a white imperium versus a white diaspora. So he goes through defining these things, but from my impression of the article, he was very, I don't know how to say, energized by the idea of white imperium. That the term imperium represents sort of an old Roman term for an area that the Romans would control. This is their imperium. So I took it from Yaki's book Imperium, sort of a fascist odyssey, and here we're reinventing it in terms of the spirit of our art across the sort of white globalism, if you will. So he loved the idea because it's a sort of a moralizing concept of like, yes, let's have power, let's over our lands, our destiny, ourselves. And so this excited him, and he wrote this interesting article. He contrasted it against the concept of the white diaspora, which from my impression of his article is something that's dying, and I felt he sort of has a very black pill view of that. So I did want to ask you guys what your impressions were of his article. And Nullus, do you have any points?
Yeah, well, first, from the way I read his name, it's pronounced Treurunen.
Okay, thank you. Thank God we've got a linguist on the team here that can help us through these things.
Which is, if I understand it correctly, I mean, and he can correct us if I'm wrong, but it seems that it comes from the German loyal runes. Because Treue is loyalty and Runen is runes in German. So just as a side note, I just thought that would be interesting to explain. So the article itself, from my point of view, and this is sort of very similar to my particular interest, which is as a amateur historian, he's approaching this from a historian's perspective.
Okay.
And the way at least I'm reading his article, and he's giving explanations as far as the way the term imperium was interpreted and understood historically, what that meant within the imperium, what kind of hierarchies existed within the imperium, and how that translates into projection of message. And the diaspora term was also approached, at least from the way I'm reading it, from a historian's perspective, explaining how it evolved, who it included, and what it meant in the historic sense of the meaning. And so what he's trying to do, at least, and again, I'm welcome to read his responses to this, but the way I'm understanding this is he's trying to figure out in what age we are living in right now. Are we living in the age of Imperium, or are we living in the age of Diaspora? And so he's trying to say that, and at least I think that he's trying to say that that we are at the tail end of Imperium, heading toward Diaspora. And so when we're in Diaspora, our power position, or global power position, is much weaker than when we're in Imperium. So then these automatically comes and asks the question at the end, what are the mechanisms by which Diaspora may regain its Imperium? Which is a logical question to ask if we are on the tail end of Imperium, on the cusp of Diaspora. And the next question, considering the pitfalls of modern technology, is a virtualized Imperium a long-term possibility? Now, this is, again, not necessarily, that to me is more of a cultural question as opposed to a historic question, although it is still relevant in how Imperium is expressed. And the third question is, since empires have a tendency to disintegrate, is Imperium a concept which we want to pursue long-term? And that's also a very valid argument, historically speaking, because from a historian's point of view, Imperiums are finite. They are usually longer or shorter term, depending on how it works. But throughout history, you'll see empires rise and fall constantly. So the question is how the Imperium concept falls within the historical understanding of both us as Europeans, as white people, but also in terms of how it relates to the global historic understanding of empire.
Tyler, do you want to approach these questions here? Do you? I'll read the first one more time here. What are the mechanisms by which a diaspora may regain its Imperium? And again, these questions are at the end of the article.
Okay, well, let me respond to the article in general first. Okay. First thing I'll say is big props to the author for writing this. We very much appreciate this level of engagement. So I hope everyone in the audience, if they haven't read it, they go and read it right now and send
after this video.
After this video, of course. But as for the central claims in this, there's a couple things I would dispute. The first, from a historical perspective, the idea of the Dark Ages, which is to me something that actually never existed. That was more of, it was called that because historically they had very little record of it. And so when you had Whig historians coming along to present a modernist narrative of progress and stepping out of darkness, they essentially filled that gap themselves and said there was a dark age in which we've emerged into scientific rationalism, which of course is false, right? The medieval ages were actually a very, very intense time of cultural and intellectual production. Most of the views they had actually made sense given the science and the math of the time. And so when it comes to like the trials of Galileo and things like that, and various aspects of Whig history that play into the role of what we think of Dark Ages, the truth about that is a little more complex and a little more interesting. So I'd encourage the author to have a conversation with me about that at one point. I would definitely love to fill in the gaps because there's only so much things on the stream I could say other than talk about it generally because I don't want to take up too much time. But the other point to answer is the projection of birth rates. Now, yes, it's certainly likely, given the birth rates, that we're not going to jump up in terms of numbers anytime soon. Yeah. One thing I'll say, though, is that centers of power emanating from an imperium, no matter where you place that unipolar world stemming from, whether that be the American Empire, which is where it is right now, the birth rates aren't, and the majority or minority status is not decisive when it comes to the center of power. I mean, ultimately us in this movement have an understanding of who actually does make the policy decisions in America, and it's not the majority population, right? We know exactly who it is. And so the ability to effectively wield power is not dependent on majority or minority status. It's based on hegemony, essentially. So it certainly seems to me, given our understanding of the present political conditions that we live in, that it is very possible to have a center of power that stems primarily from us, even if we don't have majority status. And that is something that we excel at doing. And just to problematize that a little bit more, we talk about, for example, the kind of global home world that we live in. In a sense, there is an alignment there with Zionist interests and Jewish interests, but at the exact same time, there's also an expression of modernist Anglo-liberalism that has effectively homogenized a lot of the world, right? And has played a bigger role in the problems that we have. So in a sense, you could argue, while we don't have exactly the control seat of power, it is largely was our own doing, right? And the author certainly alluded to that when he talked about, for example, our waning influence in South Africa. So I think there's a lot of interesting questions for wider discussion when it comes to geopolitics. So just to tie this in, and I guess I'll answer the questions, what are the mechanisms by which the diaspora might regain its imperium? Well, this is more, to me, of a higher political theory question than a question of Imperium Art. It's definitely an essential question. It's a question that we try to answer in EBL. Mm-hmm. But what we're effectively working on is the sense in which all successful revolutions are based, which is elaborating a dynamic and creative approach to power and the wielding of power that is more capable of solving the crises of the globe better than our rivals, essentially. Because what you're seeing is various contenders for the crisis of neoliberalism attempting to exploit its rupture and prop up an answer that will work, and sending out a variety of professionals to fill that gap, right? And so what you learn when you're trying to deal with the hard questions, which other paradigms can't answer, and I hate to say it, our own can't answer it either, because it's essentially non-verbatim in the dissident right. We don't talk about these difficult questions. Just earlier today, I was having a conversation about how we would approach the geopolitical consequences of, for example, the impact of the Rwandan genocide. And now, of course, you could say, well, it's not our role to play, right? We're not the moral police, and sure. But nonetheless, when you look at what takes place in continents like Africa, everything we do directly spills over into geopolitical reality in our own borders, even if our borders are closed. Like there's about a million different scenarios I could think of how that impacts us. And so we have to be able to present a responsible vision. Now, that's not to say sit here and emptily theorize, right? Because when you're theorizing about power, you're effectively critiquing the weakening power of the present. You're presenting a moral challenge to it. And this forms the basis of successful revolutions. So if you look back at all of them, you can look back at the revolutions we don't like, from the French Revolution all the way to the Bolsheviks, is that the way in which they're able to stir up and gain support was the fact that they provided solutions to questions and concerns and the suffering of the people that they needed answers. And they provided answers, even though their answers were shitty and destructive. They stepped into the arena. So far, the dissident right has not stepped into the arena. We have a very reflexive response when it comes to these kind of questions. You take a look at, for example, the recent debate over having solidarity with Palestinians. Okay, well, there's always a reflexive response based entirely on race, and of course we should have a positive preference for our own race. But take a look at Mosley, for example. He said we should go on dealing with the poverty in the world and we should solve it. Let's get on with the doing of it. That's directly out of one of his speeches. But he says you have to be able to answer and become strong for your own people first, and you have to have a sense of who you are, and that's absolutely crucial. But we should not reflexively engage in this isolationist stance from the world, right? And now it ties into my answer for the third question. Is Imperium a concept that we want to pursue long term? Ideally, I don't wish that was the case, but it actually is, because we live in a globally connected world. And as I was saying, all these various crises and consequences and geopolitical rivals do matter, right? If one of the empire in the currently unipolar world, and say it becomes multipolar, and then over time it devolves into another unipolar world, what happens is the amount of influence that we gain loses. Same with access to resources, places of security, etc., etc. And I don't want to sound like a neoconservative, but these are realities that you have to deal with in the 21st century. So if you try to revert to like a petty nationalism based on the primacy of one ethnic culture, and then what you end up having is the problem of constructing yet another global order, right? Because you need a global order of nation states to effectively agree that there's going to be like a sort of treaty between nations where trade is prioritized, aggressors are combated, but nonetheless you are effectively propping up a universal moral legislation that goes into creating a global order of nation states. This is the problem with Pizzoni's book, Virtue of Nationalism, is when he tries to actually deal with the real concrete messy realities on the ground of geopolitics and the conflicts of interest, obviously that abstract theorizing about isolated nation states simply fades away into nothing. It has absolutely no answer. So I think Imperium as a concept, when it comes to where we are in the world in a technologically advanced and connected way that we live, is of crucial importance. And it's something we have to engage in whether we like it or not. The pitfalls of modern technology of virtualized Imperium, a long-term possibility. I think so, but I think I would tie this to one of our earlier discussions that we had, which was on we were talking about consumer art, and we were talking about the ways in which technology can hamper the development of art. Say, for example, the way television has overridden the great novel. It's largely the same phenomenon in the sense that modern technology is very much a pharmacon. It's a poison and a cure. And so we have abilities to connect with people, but what we see, like we've seen happening in the last couple of weeks, is the way in which various disputes get propped up and they get shared with anons, and they all jump in, and then they have their own understanding, and then what was irony becomes unironic, and then next thing you know, you don't have much of an Imperium. You have pointless squabbling while you're not actually doing anything. What ends up happening is we're becoming more and more relevant. We're having these arguments in an echo chamber and effectively not actually presenting any sort of united, interesting front that's capable of solving the problems of today. So I think it's certainly possible, but this is going to require a hell of a lot of maturity that, quite frankly, the distant right has not shown that it's able to handle quite yet.
This is a good time to insert a question. Do you think Imperium Art could help us grow in maturity towards that? Towards greater unity and less squabbling and etc.
Donald, if I may reply first to what Tyler was saying, and then also answer that question that you posed. So I fully agree with the premise. First of all, the Dark Ages was a good catch, and that's an important topic to cover and enlighten, no pun intended. So definitely we should address that question on perhaps in a separate topic or a separate conversation. But suffice it to say, there are many layers to unravel here with regard to the questions that were brought up. So the mechanisms by which a diaspora may regain its Imperium. So we have to look at this also domestically, not just geopolitically. We have to also consider that within a particular, if you take the United States, if you take a particular country like the United States, then the concept of Imperium can also be understood and construed as a social concept, a class structure, if you will, where people who arrive in the United States want to become a part of that Imperium, and that's where the battles are fought. And historically, the Imperium in that context was dominated by Europeans, by white Europeans, almost from the inception until the past maybe 50, 60 years. So this is an internal struggle, not a geopolitical struggle, where the immigrant is fighting for its relevance within this empire, this social superstructure within the United States. And so that's where the attacks, that's where you see attacks, that's where you see the anti-white propaganda, because that approach by attacking the dominant group is a signal to say that we're here and we want a slice of the pie. Now, obviously, the more groups that you have, the more divergent groups that you have, the more conflicts you have. And of course, they're always going to attack the one that's in power, unless that group that's in power has the hierarchical wherewithal and will to assert itself, which in this case is not happening. And that could be explained by many different ways. Perhaps the liberalist individualist mentality, the secularism, all these different topics then flow into this question of why the particular, why the dominant culture in the Imperium, quote unquote, is not asserting itself, is not resisting and putting its foot down. On the geopolitical level, I fully agree with Tyler that we have to have some kind of a policy message. We have no tangible power as a movement, and again, even as saying that it's a movement is also somewhat maybe premature, because I think the evolution is going that direction, but I don't think we're there just yet. I would say that we do have to take policy positions. We have to project a message, and the power that we have is in our message and how we express our positioning. And again, as Tyler correctly said, we first have, and I think, Donald, you and I had this conversation a while back also on how we relate to other groups, both within the nation and outside on a geopolitical level. So, you have to ask yourself the question of where you position yourself. You have to ask the question also, which is very important, of how you relate to others. But if you don't have a confidence, if you're not coming from a power position, if you have no confidence in your position, then you really have nothing to discuss. You're just then throwing out, and I'm not talking about the dissident right, I'm talking about us as people, as Europeans, as whites. If we don't have a message to give, then really everyone's going to come and take whatever they can. So we have to formulate messages. We have to formulate and articulate various alternatives, solutions. The solutions I personally believe should be in the, when it comes at least to geopolitical issues, when it comes to relations that we have with other groups outside of our spheres, these should be primarily based on the realpolitik, the realpolitik approach, the strategic approach. I would honestly forego ideology in that respect. I think that it's a situational question more than it is an ideological or principled question. I think that the more important question is how we relate in general, and the principle itself could be defining that strategy. That, I believe, is a good way to approach it. I think that people on the dissident right should be writing a lot more policy papers in this regard, should be discussing various issues relating to different nations, how those positions are juxtaposed against our interests. And also we have to take into consideration, what negotiating power do you have even with your message? So for example, I can say that I support the Palestinian cause because it serves my interest. And I will form an alliance with them to discredit against someone against whom we have mutual grievances. That's all fine and good. But then the question then also arises, okay, then do we have some kind of connection with a person like the Dalai Lama, who says that the Europeans shouldn't have, who advocates against the invasion of Europe? So we have a lot of these questions that are open that we should address. But we have to address it, again, just as Tyler said accurately, with maturity. We have to address it objectively. We should take out the ideology behind it, and we should put it more towards a policy position. That's my view. Now, how that relates to the question of, since empires have a tendency to disintegrate, is Imperium a concept which we want to pursue long term? Again, it comes down to a strategy question and a historic question. We have to ask ourselves, which type of empire do we want? Do we want a top-down empire that imposes values upon the components? Or do we want an empire that consists of component nations that form a union and then create an empire? So there are many different answers to this, and it's not a black and white issue. And I think that we do definitely need, so just to give you an example, we definitely need a European Union of one kind or another. The question is, what kind of European Union should we be talking about? Same thing with the United States. I mean, I think that the United States is stronger as a whole than it would be if it broke down into its components. And from a geopolitical point of view, it's more important to have that. But then the question arises, who's controlling this empire? Who's controlling these empires? And I think finally, I just want to add that I personally don't like the term petty nationalism. I believe that that's an incorrect approach. I think the term I prefer to use is organic nationalism, foundational nationalism, because again, we talking about imposing values on other nations, imposing policy and strategy on other nations, or are we talking about a means where we can find ways to work together? And I think this is where Imperium Art is very important. I think this is where Imperium Art can provide a bridge and can give us that maturity to help us learn methodologies and shared symbolisms and ways where we can work together.
This is some profound stuff, and I actually feel this is a great place to put a bookmark in it, because that opens up a whole new conversation that we could actually invite other people in on. It is so enormous that I think we're going to need a little more time to think about it, talk about it, and get a couple ideas together. I already have some ideas that I think we'll share maybe in the next show. But this is a really, really brilliant jumping off point. And again, I'm very grateful to the author of this article, whom I can't pronounce your name, for doing this, not for us per se, but for the movement, for everyone.
Freudonen.
Yeah, thank you. And what he said. And so this has just been a really beautiful and enriching conversation. I just want to give you guys one more chance if there's any last comments that you have, and then also to share where people can find you online. No, sorry, Tyler?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at SamsterWhitnet. You can find me on the MPI Radix channel for my show EBL. You can find me on my personal channel on YouTube, Thamster Whitnet, also very surprising. Yeah, I guess that's it.
Beauty. And Nullus?
You can find me on Twitter, and let me just give you, it's at Nullus at Abnormocracy, and my website is abnormocracy.com. I'm starting to get used to using this word, so hopefully it'll stick with people as well. It's abnormal democracy, Abnormocracy.
Mm-hmm. And do we have a show this Sunday? Poetry show?
No, we don't have a show this coming Sunday. I'm planning a show for, what is that, May 31st, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Let me just double check.
You want to promote that a little bit? Either, like, Tyler, do you have any upcoming shows that you would like to promote at all?
Yeah, this Saturday is our next EBL episode, so we'll be talking about Herbert Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man. Now, I will say, when most people are talking about cultural Marxism and its negative influence, unwittingly, they're actually talking about Herbert Marcuse. So this is the episode you'll see me be the most critical in. We're also being joined by Tony Hovitar for that episode, so that's really exciting.
Wonderful.
Anything upcoming? Tomorrow, me and Spencer are doing a stream on the rise and fall of the Me Too movement. So there's that. And then what was I going to say? Oh, yeah. 2 weeks' time, we have a huge surprise on EBL that's going to make a lot of people happy. But I'm not saying what it is because it's a surprise, and that would be lame if I ruined it. But the episode is called Myths of Revolution, and we're basically disputing the idea that revolutions are grassroots and come from the bottom, from a mass rising up. And we're going to do a historical analysis. But we also have a huge surprise. So if there's anyone to look out for and make you all really happy, look out for that one.
Excellent. We got an early Christmas coming over at Radix. Fabulous. Nullus, you want to tell us a little bit about your upcoming guests?
Yes, I'm planning to have, so far it's in the works, so it's not fully confirmed yet, but my next poetry cast will be on May 31st on Sunday, and it'll be at 8 p.m. And my guests will be I'll have someone from Croatia and someone from Poland, and we'll be discussing nationalism in poetry with relation to Central Europe. And this will be, again, part of a greater series to cover other countries in Central and Eastern Europe. But eventually, I'd like to cover nations all over Europe. So, but this particular one will be myself, and I'll have two other guests. One is Croatian and one is Polish, and I'll be sending out the information shortly.
And so there's a small little thing I wanted to add that I'm really, on behalf of actually the entire movement, I'm really grateful that Nullus is bridging people from Eastern Europe into our movement, our dialogue. There's a lot of, I feel that this is very much a, North America and Western Europe. So there's so many Eastern European voices that have not yet been heard, and I'm really grateful that you're able to kind of create a bridge to bring people in. So that's wonderful. And then my website, AmericanZarathustra.com. So thanks so much for joining us, and we will be talking again next week. Everybody have a great evening.